Hello, everybody. Good evening. My name is James Jordan. I think I know most people in the room and fellow people online. Welcome to this year's Howard Raine Memorial Lecture, an annual event organised under the auspices of the Parkes Institute, study of Jewish non-Jewish relations here at the University of Southampton. I usually do a bit of spiel about the Parkes Institute, but I'm going to leave that to one side this evening to say the Howard Raine Memorial Lecture. This remembers the life and work of Howard, who, with Corinne and Annabelle, has been regular faces across many of our outreach events over many years. Howard was born in Leeds, went to Leeds Medical School, and then started work as a GP in Leeds before moving to Bournemouth, where he spent most of his career. He came back to education and undertook an MA in Jewish history and culture with us, where his dissertation focused on the aliens question and issues of immigrant health. Pardon me. Howard then went on to do a PhD, again with us, comparing the London Jewish and London German hospitals, a comparative study of the medical care they offered. And I was privileged to be a reader of that in year 2, which is quite exciting. Sadly, Howard took ill towards the end of the thesis, but bravely finished and successfully defended his PhD. Howard and Corinne were very much part of the Parkes Institute's community, and the Raine Lecture on Jewish medical history celebrates his life and career and the ongoing bonds between the Parkes Institute, the Raine family, and our friends in the Bournemouth community. So, thank you. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Yair Wallach from SOAS, where he's reader in Israeli studies and the head of the SOAS Center for Jewish Studies. He has written on urban and material culture in modern Palestine and Israel. His book, A City in Fragments, Urban Text in Modern Jerusalem, published in 2020, won the Jordan Schnitzler Book Prize in 2022. He is currently working on a book entitled Arab Ashkenazi on the integration and enculturation of East European Jews in the modern Arab Levant. Different parts of his project have been published in Jewish Social Studies and various other places. He's also written for The Guardian, The New Statesman, Haaretz, and other publications on Palestine, Israel, and anti-Semitism. His talk this evening draws directly from material from his new book, and it's my pleasure to introduce to him and his lecture, Ashkenazi Medical Professionals in the Arab Middle East.
Thank you very much.
I will get down to go.
Okay, where should I stand?
It's not floating well. How?
Yeah,
it's fine.
it's
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for coming. Thank you for the people online. Thank you for the invitation. Very happy to be here. This talk, I'll talk about Ashkenazi medical professionals, primarily doctors, but also pharmacists, nurses, dentists in the Arab Middle East. Now, maybe it's good to start with this character, which is a good way, as a good example of the kind of things that I want to go beyond. So the kind of, if we think of Jewish Ashkenazi doctors in the Middle East, so there's two types. One is and this is the Isaac Darbela is a kind of eccentric adventurer character. He was born as Yitzhak Amchislavsky in Ukraine, in Polatva, and he went to medical school in Petersburg and then in the Sorbonne. Was a Russian military doctor and then ended up in Switzerland practicing. From there, he goes to Alexandria, and then he becomes the personal doctor of the Sultan of Zanzibar. And he's not the only Ashkenazi personal doctor of a king in the Middle East. I have various other examples, but of course, not too many of them. From there, he's recruited to be the doctor of the colony Rishon LeZion by the Rothschild philanthropy that, of course, sponsors the colony, and from there he becomes the doctor of the Rothschild Hospital in Jerusalem. He ends up, after some controversy I'm not going to go into, but he ends up kind of escaping Jerusalem, going to Palermo, and from there to Tunisia. He dies in Tunis. So quite a colorful figure. So here we have two kind of themes. One is this kind of colonial adventurism, and I said Darbella is not the only one. By the way, his name is after he was given a small island by the Sultan of Zanzibar called Darbella, and kind of called himself after. So this is one. Much more familiar would be to tell the story of Jewish doctors as part of the story of Jews and Palestine and the story of Zionism. Okay, so that would be the colony of Rishon LeZion, that being part of the Jewish national revival and the colonization of Palestine. So this is kind of one theme. And another maybe connected is Jewish philanthropy with Palestine. That's a Rothschild hospital in Jerusalem. That is networks of Jewish philanthropy active in Palestine to, as a kind of enlightenment mission. So the Rothschild is the Alliance and others. So that's the kind of themes that we know. So these are Jewish stories primarily, whether it's a story of colonies and Zionism and so forth, whether it's a story of Jewish attachment that has a philanthropic element and is within the Jewish imaginary and very much tied to Palestine on the land of Israel. And any relation to the Middle East appears either kind of eccentric, in the case of this kind of guy, or coincidental. So we know other doctors that had ties with Arab patients and so forth, but that seems a kind of secondary element of their story. So what if we think of other stories? So this is one other stories, also somewhat eccentric, but a very different story. So this is a guy called Alexei Rabinovich, born in Odessa. Alexei Alexandrovich Rabinovich, we don't know exactly when he was born. He goes to medical school in Berlin. He comes back and he serves in the Russian-Japanese War. After that, he decides he wants to see the world, and he goes traveling, and he gets to Cairo and Helwan, which is this sanatorium city outside of Cairo. It's a modern thing where it's kind of attracting doctors and various kinds of tourists, people coming to convalesce. And he falls in love with the place. He really likes it there. He decides, okay, I'm going to immigrate here. This looks like a booming place, and I'm going to open a sanatorium here, and I'll my practice, and this is going to be where I'm going to make a living. So he settles in Helwan. He marries Nelly Russo, who's a Sephardic, local Jewish Sephardi Jew, and he sets his shop there. So this is quite a different story. It's a story of migration driven by economic opportunities. And Egypt in the early 20th century, and he settles there around 1907, is a land of opportunities in this area. It's booming, whether we talk about the Suez Canal, whether we talk about cotton, whether we talk about tobacco, various kinds of industry. And it's seen as a land of opportunities which attracts immigration primarily from the southern Mediterranean, from Italy, from Greece, but also of Ashkenazi Jews that settle in Egypt for economic reasons. Rabinovich's story takes an interesting turn where he decides to convert to Islam and change his name to Ali. He's known as Dr. Ali locally. And then he develops symptoms of insanity gradually. ends up going to Paris to his brother, being hospitalized there and dies at a young age in 1916. And turns out he had syphilis, and that kind of may explain also the conversion. I mean, the family was unthrilled about the conversion. His grandson is the British author Gabriel Josipovici. So that's one of the sources for this story. Okay. So this is again a different story, a story that first is about economic migration that ties Egypt into Mediterranean networks, in which the Jewish element appears secondary rather than primary. And interestingly, it brings us to Egypt rather than Palestine. If we think of the Jews in the Levant, the story that people tell is a focus very much on migration to Palestine, whether it's a Zionist story or not. That's there's a ton of vision on Palestine. That's something that I want to challenge in my current research. So as you heard in the introduction, I'm currently working on a book on Jewish migration from Eastern Europe to the Levant, with a focus on acculturation and integration in Arab society and culture, broadly speaking. Mainly I'm looking at Palestine because that's where most migrants go, but it's important also to widen the scope to think of the migration in Palestine not necessarily through the usual way we think about it, but to open up other possibilities which should exist and certainly are relevant in the case of Egypt and Lebanon and elsewhere. And I'm interested in medical professionals as part of that story. And as we will see in the lecture, it's a story of mobility. And it's both mobility in a kind of material, geographic sense. So it's people traveling, migrating to the region, and for multiple reasons. It could be either because they're escaping a persecution, they can seek economic options, they may be Zionist, driven by religious sentiment or ideological sentiment, and so forth. But there's also migration within the region. So there's mobility between, not just unidirectional migration into the region, but also we see a lot of movement within the region. And we see also outside the region. So we have examples of medical professionals that are trained in the region or practice in the region and then use it as a springboard to migrate to other places. So it's not necessarily the end of the journey. Sometimes it's a starting point from which people go elsewhere. And that's partly part of my attempt to think of Jewish migration to the region, not necessarily as a unidirectional movement charged with ideological sentiment, but to think of it more as a kind of flow, a different kind of flows. But as we will see, we can also talk about social mobility, because medicine generally, and particularly becoming a doctor, but also becoming a pharmacist, etc., is an avenue of social mobility. It's not, the kind of cliche of a Jewish doctor. It is not for nothing. It's an avenue that gives you skills that are useful, that provide for social mobility, and the skills that you can transfer, right? Particularly, we see it with doctors. It's very easy to migrate when you are a doctor. It's a kind of training and skills that is much wanted more or less everywhere you go. But also it's true to other whether you're a dentist or pharmacist, but to a less extent. So especially if you come from underprivileged position, whether in terms of class or in terms of gender, if you're a woman, that becoming a medical professional is one of the classic, I would say, routes towards social mobility. And it allows to cut across social boundaries, particularly when we talk about the Middle East. So beyond confessional religious difference, but beyond ethnic difference, because it's something that is, as a doctor or as a pharmacist, people come to you and they usually come to you from all walks of life, all kind of groups, and as a result, you develop relations that cut across various divides. Okay. So first, maybe I should say that when we talk about the early 19th century, then we're talking about people that were not trained in medical schools and did not have diplomas and certificates, but still found themselves, we see that a lot of migrants find themselves in the position of doctor. Because, and if we take someone like Israel Bach, who's from Ukraine, who comes to settles in Safed in the 1830s, and he's a practical man, he's a technical man, he's a watchmaker and he's a printer. He brings a print shop. This is one of the first books that he prints in 1941. But because he's someone that comes from other places and people know that he has various knowledge, they ask him, do you know anything about medicine? And one of his early breaks is when he is recommended as a doctor to Ibrahim Pasha, who is the son of the leader of Egypt, who is ruling Palestine at that moment. He's in Akka, not far from Safed. So he's recommended, he's able to cure Ibrahim Pasha of whatever ailment he had, and as a result, he gets an entry point to the Egyptian political establishment, and that kind of helps him both in getting land locally and getting connections that would be useful later. So this is not an unusual story. You have a lot of people, whether it's connecting to the powers that be or locally, if we have similar stories about, a doctor more like people say more a quack that ends up in Bethlehem as the local doctor, although he has no medical training. Again, an Ashkenazi migrant. So this is kind of the kind of stories that we'll see. And similarly, we see a lot of uncertified pharmacists. At this point in 1870, you can open a pharmacy. You don't have to have a proper license. And for a lot of people, this is a kind of an avenue to for business and so forth. And the same about midwife. By the late 19th century, there's a growing need for demand for some certificate and proper licensing, both from potential customers, but also from the Ottoman Empire that expects you to go through training, go to school, and get a proper license, whether you're a pharmacist and if you're a doctor. So an example for one story of this kind of mobility I can tell in the story of Helena Kagan. Helena Kagan was born in Tashkent in 1889 to a Russified Jewish family, and she studied medicine in Switzerland, and then goes back to Russia and the Russian Empire, and her father dies, and his last request is that she goes to visit Palestine. And then she said, because she lost her father, because she's looking for a place to practice medicine, she decides to go with her mother and to settle in Palestine. So this is a kind of somewhat Zionist, and there's also a somewhat Zionist sentiment there. And she settles in Palestine in early 1914. At first, she goes to, she hopes to be a doctor in Tel Aviv. And there's way too many doctors in Tel Aviv. So people are, no, it's, you're not, you won't find any work here. So she goes to Jerusalem. And she is seeking to get approval for convert her diploma to a local one. She goes to the local head of medicine of the district, Omar Bey, and he tells them, sorry, I can't convert your license because women can't study medicine in the Ottoman Empire, and therefore we can't give you an official license. But that's no problem. If you can open a practice, you can see people, nobody would do anything for you, and And so it's kind of quite a laissez-faire situation. So he recommends quite a lot of people to her, mainly from the aristocracy, and she develops a very strong ties with the Husseini family, the aristocratic family known, of course, later by the because of the Mufti Haj Amin Husseini becomes the leader of Palestinians and opponent of Zionism, but has various positions of power. So she opens a local practice, and her big break comes during the World War I, where there's a lot of need for doctors. And that's where she is recommended for the local municipal hospital, first as someone in charge of the nurses, and then very quickly the local doctor in charge, who's Dr. Fotios Efkelidis from Greek origin, sees how talented she is and puts her in charge of the night shift as a doctor, and then he dies quite abruptly. And the municipality tells her, okay, you're in charge, you're now the director of the hospital gets a delegation from Istanbul, comes, tests her, and gives her the supposedly the first official license for a woman doctor in the Ottoman Empire. This is according to the newspaper at this time. That's at least the story. And she practiced medicine. She is there as the interim director of the hospital for about a year. Then she has some kind of a fight with a doctor that is appointed to oversee the hospital. After a year, she leaves the hospital, and then she becomes she's attached to the Hadassah establishment. But that experience, I mean, again, she arrives to Palestine, she speaks no relevant language really. She doesn't speak Arabic, and she doesn't even speak Yiddish, which it would be helpful with the local Jewish community. And she picks up these languages quite quickly by just seeing a lot of patients. And from there, from there on, she has a relationship with Arab Palestinian patients. Certainly in 1948, she practiced one day a week in the Children's Hospital in the Old City, where she saw Arab patients, and she also was the private doctor for the Husseini family and Haj Amin Husseini. And there's a story that she told the newspaper how in 1937 she is called to see the son of Haj Amin. Now, at this point, Haj Amin is hiding in the Al-Aqsa compound, in the Temple Mount. He's wanted by the British, who cannot raid the Temple Mount because it's too sensitive. And it's the Arab revolt, height of tensions between Arabs and Jews and so forth. And still, and Haj Amin himself is already seen as enemy of the Jews and enemy of Zionism. Still, Helena Kagan sees it as a medical duty, first and foremost, to go and treat the son of Haj Amin, and she goes there, and she describes kind of being brought there through the old city, and everybody's kind of watching. Like this is a very strange visit. So this is kind of one example of someone who is quite rapidly able to cut through these barriers and achieve quite a significant status, because doctors are needed, because the skills are needed, even if it doesn't conform to local laws and regulations. Another kind of migration we see if we jump 30 years later, and these are Jewish refugees from Central Europe, which come not only to Palestine, but also to Egypt. This is the nurse Thea Wolf, who is a German Jewish nurse from Frankfurt, who goes to Egypt. She's recommended to go to work in a Jewish hospital, first in Cairo and then in Alexandria. And she uses that position and the relation she establishes with local officials in Alexandria to allow hundreds of Jewish refugees from Central Europe to land in Alexandria. And some of them end up working as doctors, and we have quite a few examples. Some of them find refuge from other in other ways. One story is that, this is after 39, a ship stops in Alexandria. There's Jewish refugees on the ship, desperate to find anywhere to land. They're not allowed to land because there's already war and they are enemy subjects. And of course, the British are in charge, so they're not supposed to. And local port officials, Egyptians, tell Tawun, we can arrange something. Why don't you make them sick? And they can then be brought down to shore, sent to the hospital, and then they visit them. That's what happens with this group specifically. So this is another story in which Jewish philanthropic networks facilitate the arrival of a nurse from Germany, which then ends up an entry point for refugees that come later and fleeing the Nazis. And we have several of these examples. Now we have other stories of people that are not coming from Europe as medical professionals, but rather migrate to the region of the Middle East, and then once they are in the region, study medicine and become doctors, nurses, pharmacists, and so on. So to give you this kind of one example, the story of the Romanov family. So Shaul Chaim Romanov is born in Russia, goes to military service in the Russian Empire, escapes after a few years, and gets to the Ottoman Empire, and arrives in Aleppo, and settles in Aleppo, where he marries Sylvia Sassoon, and she is much more worldly than him. She was trained in Paris in the Alliance. She's a teacher, and she went to various places around the world. And he becomes a clerk, translator for the courts. He works in various clerical positions. And then their son, Aryeh Leon Romanov, first goes to Paris to become, again, part of the Alliance Israélite Universelle, becomes a teacher in the Alliance, then decides that's not for him, and he goes to Beirut to Saint Joseph Medical School, the French university in Beirut, decides to become a doctor. He marries Susanna Berghoff. She's from Romanian Jewish parents that came to Palestine, he to Jaffa and she to Zichron Yaakov, the Moshava colony. And their daughter, again, is a teacher for the Alliance schools. And they get married and they go back to Aleppo, and their son, Henri Romanov, again goes to Beirut, Saint Joseph, and goes back to Aleppo, is a doctor practicing there. So you see these dynasties, and it's quite a typical story that we have 3 generations of doctors or pharmacists, and we see that becoming a doctor is a way for social mobility, often connected with marrying into Sephardi Jewish families. So you see here how part of the acculturation is marrying into, in this case, is the Sassoon, the Syrian branch of the Sassoon family, and leads one to these kind of, to Beirut, back to Aleppo, for example, to take part in the local Freemasons as one of the kind of networks of connections, but also connections to other Jews that come from Eastern Europe, to Palestine, to Zionist colonies, and so forth. There's a similar story about the Rosenfeld family in Baghdad. Grandfather, a tailor, starts as a tailor, sends his kids to Beirut to become doctors, and then their own kids also become doctors and so forth. And very, very integrated usually into Syrian or Baghdadi Jewish communities. To give another example is the Lapin. This is a book by a colleague of mine, Najat Abdulhaq, maybe in the audience, maybe not today, but she wrote a book on the role of Jewish and Greek communities in Egyptian economy. A lot of what she deals with is big capitalists, big companies, and investment, but the cover of the book is the Lapin pharmacy. Lapin family is a very similar story of regional mobility. You have a Jewish Ashkenazi Orthodox family in Jerusalem, goes to Jaffa, then the kids go to study to become pharmacists in Beirut, in the universities. And from there, the biggest economic opportunities are in Egypt. So a lot of times we see these movements from Palestine to Beirut, and from Beirut to Alexandria, to Cairo, to the Canal, Ismailia, Port Said, and elsewhere. Now, and this may be a good time to talk about Beirut as a regional education hub, in which we see a lot of these Jews from all over the region, but also specifically Eastern European Jews. And she said that this is part I wrote with a colleague of mine, Liat Kozma from the Hebrew University. We wrote an article about Beirut as a hub for medical education. And we looked not specifically at Ashkenazim, we looked about Ashkenazim, Sephardic, Arabic-speaking Jews from the entire region, but I'm going to focus here on Ashkenazi Jews. And this is from the Hebrew newspaper Hashkafa in 1908, which says that when you walk in Beirut, you hear Hebrew more than any other language except for Arabic, French, and English. So the fourth language that you hear in Hebrew, this is probably an exaggeration, but we do have, by that time, Beirut is established as a regional hub, both for commerce, for banking, but also for education. Because of the two big universities there, the Syrian Protestant College, later the American University of Beirut, which is tuition is in English, and the Saint Joseph, where tuition is in French. And these are hubs, both that they attract students from all across the region, including Greece and Turkey and Iraq and Egypt and Palestine and so forth. And once they're there, as the editor says, once they leave, they graduate as doctors, pharmacists, commerce. They usually settle in one of the cities of Turkey in Egypt. Some of them even go further. So that kind of sense of movement, and that characterizes, I would say, the late Ottoman period, where we see movement across the region. I mentioned these. Both of these institutions come from a missionary, started up missionaries and opened their medical schools early, and then later pharmacy, nursing, and dental schools. And it takes time until we start seeing Jewish students in these schools, but then they become quite significant numbers. Before the First World War, we talk about, I think our numbers are about 80 Jewish students in various, primarily in medicine, and a bit more than half are Ashkenazim. It's quite striking. So already at this point, the late Ottoman period, more than half, about 55%, are Ashkenazim that come from various kind of backgrounds. So to give you, I have one background. This is Hermann Goldwald, born to an Ashkenazi family in Edirne. So his parents probably from Galicia, from Austria, Austrian Empire, they go to the Ottoman Empire. He's born, and he goes to Beirut to studies medicine, goes back to Istanbul, works in the British hospital, marries a British woman, moved to London, does not practice as a doctor. This is his naturalization papers I found in the public record office. So he probably didn't like what's nice. So, but he is the first to the first year of a Jewish graduate from the AUB, the American University of Beirut. So this gives you one example, not necessarily from Palestine, although many of them do come from Palestine. But the large numbers are after the World War I, where there's more professions and more people coming into the region. So that comes. So overall, we're talking about 350 Jewish students in medical professions only in these two universities, which is a significant numbers. The biggest numbers are in medicine and nursing, midwives, but quite a few also dentists and pharmacy. And the longer we go, the more significant the number of Jewish students in those years. So we have in nursing, the total, the Jewish students made up more than a fifth of nurses came out of the AUB or Jewish. So you have, and in other professions, we have some years it's 10%, 12%, etc., where the Jewish students make a significant number. And Ashkenazim are the majority, clear majority. By the end of the, if we look at that period, Ashkenazim make 2/3 of the students. So quite a significant number. Our sources mainly are the alumni books of the AUB and Saint Joseph, which have little biographies, and other many sources, whether it's genealogy websites, memoirs, autobiographies, and so forth. Now, so I mentioned various kind of trajectories. One interesting trajectory that we see in the American University of Beirut is American Jewish students who cannot get into US universities because of anti-Semitism. They want to go to elite universities in the US. They cannot get into these, but because the American University of Beirut is part of the American system, they go to Beirut and study medicine there, and from there they go back to the US and practice in medicine there. This is one story of Robert Seinfeld, who remembers the AUB very fondly, and a Mediterranean city is a city without prejudice. He mentions Professor Otto Kaya. There's an interesting story of a German non-Jewish professor for medicine who left Germany because of the Nazis, and he goes to Beirut and gets a position in Beirut for several years before he goes, I think, to the US. But in Beirut, there's a kind of climate of hospitality towards refugees and people coming from various places, including this group of, not huge, but I think in the dozens, small dozens of US doctors that come to Beirut to study medicine as part of the story. I should say that by this time, most of students that come to Beirut are recent migrants to Palestine. And now, if I said that before that we have this kind of image of mobility across the region, it becomes much more of a story of Jews migrating to Palestine, and from there they go to Beirut as the local university, the local biggest university. There are various trainings in Palestine as part of the Jewish Yishuv, but the largest university in the region is in Beirut. And in some cases, we talk about Jewish students who finish, in this case, in the San Joseph College, they finish their degree in San Joseph. So these are people that started their degrees in two cases in Prague or Vienna, are expelled by the Nazis from these institutions, and then come to Palestine and then go to Beirut to finish their studies there. So this is kind of one trajectory, but a lot of the others are people that migrate to Palestine, then seek a place to study medicine or nursing or other kind, or dentist or pharmacist. One example to give you a flavor is the story of Shifra Birnberg. So she's born in Ukraine. Her family immigrates to Palestine in 1922. And after she finishes high school, she wants to study nursing. There's an option to study in Jerusalem, in Hadassah. But a family friend from the same town in Ukraine says, well, my son goes to Beirut. Like, why go to Odessa? This is great. This is cheaper. It's a great place to study. It's international university. And go to Beirut. She goes to Jerusalem to check out Hadassah. She says, oh, maybe I should go to Beirut. And she goes there, remembers it as a fantastic experience, and has a circle of friends like her of Jews, Nazi background, that go to Beirut and study there, and then come back. And these recollections are through her son's autobiography, unpublished yet. Or her son is Eliakim Rubinstein, who's had an illustrious career as a secretary, cabinet secretary in Israel, and a judge in the Supreme Court. And he generously shared this with me and with Liat, and he said it's very clear. She remembered it very fondly, and it gave her proficiency in Arabic that maybe extend my. He was always interested in Arabic, and he did degrees in Middle East and so forth. And if I should say something about relations with Arab students, and one of the things about Beirut, on the one hand, it's a place where you study in French and in English rather than Arabic. So in that sense, it trains you as part of the international networks rather than specifically Arab networks. But most of the students are not Jews and are Arabs from the various parts of the Middle East, including Palestinian students. And this kind of is an interesting encounter. This is from the memoirs of Hala Sakakini. She is the daughter of a very important Palestinian intellectual educator, Khalida Sakakini. And she and her sister goes to Beirut to study, they study arts, but she remembers both tensions and conflicts around the issue of Zionism, but also warm friendships. And she talks about two medical students, Ilsa Nussbaum from Germany and another, Michaela Lesicka, who came from Poland. And they speak with them in German because the Sakakini sisters went to a German school in Jerusalem. They have a common language, clearly with Nussbaum, who comes from Germany, but also Lesicka with Yiddish. They somehow get along between German and Yiddish. They can communicate that creates a common language. And it was very important for her to include this in her memoir as part of the story to kind of illustrate good relations between Jews and Arabs. At the same time, I think, and I'll end here, as I said, by the 30s and 40s, first of all, we talk about a region that has far less mobility within it. And of course, the major story of Jewish migration at this point to Palestine is to the Jewish Yishuv, and within a separate Jewish society in Palestine that is not interested so much in integrated into Arab society and culture, but to create its own society and culture, and their conflict in Palestine then reflects on the situation of Jews in Arab countries throughout the regions, including Ashkenazi Jews in Egypt, Lebanon, and elsewhere. And in those years of the 40s and afterwards, we see the process of undoing relations between undoing this integration of Ashkenazi Jews into these respective society, leading to eventually the departure of Jews from these Arab countries in general, and the small Ashkenazi communities within these communities also leave. And this is kind of one example. This is not Dr. Sachs, couldn't find a picture of him, but Dr. Sachs is one example of someone who was very integrated. Born in Cairo in 1914, his parents from Eastern Europe to Jerusalem to the US to back to Palestine to Cairo, complicated history, but he's born in Cairo, grows up in a Yiddish-speaking family, studied medicine, becomes a pediatrician, and his one is more integrated, so he can read and write in Arabic, not so smoothly, but he can, and he becomes a member of the Egyptian Society of Pediatrics, and it's very important for him. He said most of his patients were Egyptian, spoke Arabic, and so forth. And he taught, and this is part of a book that has accounts, first person accounts from Egyptian Jews that end up in New York. So he even tells the story about how his local neighborhood society in Cairo in 1948, when there's of course the war between Egypt and Israel, they raise money for the Egyptian military to show their support for and their patriotism. And he says, yeah, it felt a bit strange. We're not sure, should we do this, should we not? But we really wanted to show that we are, we're really good Egyptians, and we did this. And the story in his case is that he goes for a year of internship in an American hospital in New York in 1956, and then he cannot go back. And his family ends up leaving Cairo. Much to their unhappiness, they remember Cairo as a wonderful place, a place where they had good life. He says no anti-Semitism that he experienced, but he does speak about growing xenophobia against all foreigners in the 30s and 40s. But clearly, after 56, Egyptian Jews found the position increasingly impossible. And the case of Dr. Sachs is one of them, and it's not unique in this sense. So we have here this kind of stories and these kind of networks which are overall undone, but also gradually forgotten in favor of the big familiar story that we know of Jewish migration to the region as part of Zionism and the Jewish issue. And here, but just before that, I can recommend this database, which is open to the public, Mid-East Med, by Professor Kozma in the Hebrew University, in which you can search for Jewish and non-Jewish, all kinds of doctors in the Middle East, and there's thousands of names and with biographical details of their training, where they practice, and so forth. It's part of a large story about regional history of medicine in the Middle East, in which Jews play a role, but only one part of that story, obviously. Thank you.
We have about 10 minutes for questions. If people online would like to ask questions, please type. I will check as I go along. And in the room, Simon, and no.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about the biographies. So you're writing a book, you give a lot of life, but the genre of biography, and as a historian, you presumably have a perspective on biography using very different source material, I can tell. What's your take on biographical writing, and the question of enlivening, or what's new here? What's your innovation in terms of the genre of biography?
Okay, so I think the challenge for me in the project is that each of these stories, or not each, but so many of them, are so fascinating, and so a lot of them are counterintuitive to what we know, what we think, what we partly because that's the early 20th century. You get all these kind of mad stories. One brother is a doctor, and the other ends up in the circus, going all over the place and so forth. So, and it's very easy to get sucked into these, and but also to understand, first of all, they're fascinating, and second is try to understand what is real, what is not, what is, family lore, and what is, actual historical fact. So I try to be quite strategic, but I try to have a collage of, and I have, dozens, if not hundreds of little stories in my book, because I think the accumulation of all these pieces up, like by the 10 or 15 stories, and they're all very different, you get a sense that it's not a unique person. Rather than you have a set of possibilities that allow for certain transformation, certain mobility, certain changes that people can go through, rather than being a particularly eccentric character like Dr. Adar, who's the doctor of the Sultan of Zanzibar. So this is an unusual story, but a pharmacist is a much more common story, and even doctors, etc. And so partly I'm trying to employ them to get people, I think to use that kind of biographical detail also to connect to readers, because I think readers find it interesting. I think I'm always interested in the essays, but also to employ them as a kind of accumulation. And I'll just say that the family lore is often as important as the real story. So how people tell their story. What do they write in and what do they write out? But for that, you need to do a lot of research and trying to see which is the most fruitful ones, because and the great change, I think, that is that you can sit at your desk and in 10 minutes or you can construct the life story of a person that is not known or famous, etc. Their burial certificate, their graduation certificate, you like mention in somebody else's memoirs, etc. And you can quite, without going to a physical archive, in some cases you can within minutes. In other cases, it takes months and months, and you actually have to go, and you still don't find the solution. So that's a kind of both the kind of the problem and the great promise of where we are today. Sorry, it's too long. So.
No, that's fine. It's fine.
Thanks, yeah, wonderful talk. I have many questions. I'll ask only two. Questions of other people. So thinking of the early 19th century, of your early examples, I was wondering how the people you're looking at for that period, like I think first half of the 19th, like, where do they get the contacts to go to like in your words and in their world, like how do they get like moving to this place in the first place? Is it like during their studies, they know other people? So that was one question, and then the other is also about 19th century, surprise, surprise. Like, does Egypt and other places in the Eastern Mediterranean, does the Eastern Mediterranean also attract non-Jewish Eastern European immigrants or other minority groups from Eastern Europe? Or is the story of Jewish migration to the Middle East, you tell, with a lot of nuance, unique actually? That's what my
Yeah. So the second one is a sadly, yes. I mean, a lot of Polish names in the AUB. And I know because I have to decide, are they Jewish or are they not, right? And so a lot of Polish Christian names, also Russians. So we have Germans from Russia, for example, that end up in. I think Jews are the bigger constituency there, but they're not unique. There is a Polish migration, right, after the failure of 1848. So there are these, certainly there are these two. First, second question of how they find. It's difficult. In some cases, I have the material. In other cases, not. It's very clear that Egypt is a huge hub that sucks. That what people would agree either go directly there, or from Beirut. Your biggest chances are to go there. If you want to open a pharmacy, or you want to practice as a doctor, it's just more people, and it's really, the economy is doing really good. So a lot of people go just for a few years and then maybe move elsewhere to Palestine, etc. Yeah.
That stimulated a thought for me. You very explicitly entitled this lecture about Ashkenazi. But there were only one or two little mentions, I think, of Sephardic contributors in this way, rather than saying spouses or Catholics. Am I misinterpreting, or was this largely, or even exclusively, an Ashkenazi? You could even ask that, I suppose, about Mizrahi Jews coming from other parts of the Mediterranean. What's the kind of sub-ethnic pattern going on?
No. First of all, I should emphasize that this is the topic of the lecture, but it's not just Ashkenazi. I think so. There's a significant component of what Sephardic or Mizrahi, depending depending on the exact term, but in the same year that I said that the first graduate from the Syrian Protestant College, from San Joseph, we have the first Jewish graduate the same year, and this is Shimon Moyal, who is from North African Jewish heritage, but he's already from Palestine. So his parents come from North Africa to Palestine, and he goes to Beirut to study. He goes to Cairo from there, and then to Palestine. So so we have a significant contingent of Syrian Jews, Egyptian Jews, Jews from the Greek islands, Baghdadi Jews. Before Baghdad has a medical school, they come to the AUB mainly, including so someone like the Rosenfeld family, they're Ashkenazi, but they're also Baghdadi Jews, like their mother and grandmothers are Baghdadi Jews. So and by that time they're Arabic speakers, and they are part of the Baghdadi community. So certainly a very important. The first Jewish nurse to graduate from Beirut was a Sephardic woman from Jaffa. So absolutely important part of that story. I think what we see, and that is especially in Beirut, in Cairo, we see a lot of these intermarriage between Ashkenazim and Sephardim, more than what we will see later in Palestine, where there's, by that time, a much more Ashkenazi society is there.
Thank you.
Shall I try to see if there's any questions? I think no question here, just comments. So let's
Probably a non-academic question. I think what you described seems to be a wonderful story at the start of something that could have been so positive. The Jews coming in, or Jews that might be there in the Middle Eastern world. How much do you think that Beirut, Lebanon, and the other Arab countries are kind of lost, and that being lost from sort of 1948 after when Jews went there, and there was no longer that cooperation? Just think of what's happening today in Beirut.
One of my stories is someone who actually, she's from Ashkenazi background, and she actually married a Lebanese Jew in 47, and they go from Palestine and she moves to Beirut, and there, so it's kind of it's a bit more confusing. But certainly after 48, there's dramatic drop in the number of Jewish students in these universities because they can no longer go from Palestine there. They're still from Lebanon, from Syria, and so forth. And Beirut continued to have a community until the 70s, became gradually more and more difficult. In the case of Egypt, the last remaining Jews in Cairo was two dentists, Bromberg, Sylvia Bromberg and Victor and Sylvia Bromberg, and their practice was open until the 80s in Cairo, and they were part of the committee of the Jewish community in Cairo there. So you do have these stories, the people that wanted to stay and decided to stay. It became increasingly difficult for Jews in general. I know that, that's as a result of the conflict, clearly in a situation where, that Israel bombs Lebanon and Hezbollah shooting. That's a situation in which we cannot imagine this today. But if we talk about the AUB, the American University Group, they have a very clear message of inclusivity and openness to the world and so forth that they're proud of. So I think from their perspective, they're also proud of these aspects of this system.
Thank you very much. I think our brain would really love your presentation. Pieces full stories of the doctors centered and otherwise. And I had a sort of parallel answering Sammy's question about biography, and I had the same problem looking at Jewish peddlers for criminals, that the stories were sort of remarkable and often ridiculous, that you want to have more and more of the stories and got to try and make something coherent. And that, I suppose the issue that I had was chronology. So I was covering a few chronology, and you're covering a bit chronology, and so time when medical practice changes so much in the periods covered. So one of those things, how are you dealing with that change?
Yeah, so I think, the article we wrote together will be out, and there we try to make sense of it through, in terms of understanding the difference between the Ottoman period, where there's much more mobility in the region, and the after 1920, where it's much more a story of Palestine versus Beirut. And there we had the privilege of also having these sources that allow for quantitative, kind of more classical social historian perspective, because we have the alumni book, and so we can zoom out beyond collection of stories and also see the numbers and see and make sense of that there. More generally in the book, I try to I'll take a chronological approach, but focus on different aspects in different periods. So that would be the way to do it. It's a challenge. I mean, I'm writing this now, and it's certainly, but so editing a lot of interesting stuff that could go in. So if it's, you know, the story of Trogs selling citron fruits, which is it's a remarkable story of Palestinian Ashkenazi business relationship. But again, I mean, to do it justice, I will have to look at the entire period and write a separate article on this. So I can't do this. So I can only talk about the when this trade is at its height in the late 19th century, and it's very much built on the Ashkenazi traders from the cities and Palestinian farmers from the villages in Al-Fahim, Hattin, and elsewhere. There are other parts of the story which I won't be able to include in that, but it's a challenge.
Is there a noticeable shift factor? When does the Hebrew medical factor? Like, oops, I'm trying to think. My grandpa was involved with it back in the late 40s, and by that point, has everything shifted already? You're saying so mostly active campaigns. Whenever Palestine versus Beirut split, or is there a notable fact instead then kind of Jewish medical center by excellence? Or
so it's a good question. I can't remember where the medical school. I think it's only post-state. Yeah. So in that sense, you didn't have a choice if you wanted to go. So, I mean, you could go to Europe, but the easiest thing would be to study in Beirut. There are universities in Egypt. There's this medical school, but it's much smaller in Egypt. So Beirut is the only real option. But having said that, there are thousands of medical professionals coming to the country that have their certificates from Europe. So in that sense, very quickly, locally trained from the region, doctors become a small minority in the issue. In nursing, it's a bit of a different story. They remain important because there's hundreds of them, but yes. So
migration, European doctors is much bigger.
yes, yeah, and there's fierce competition in Palestine. There's a problem that not everybody can find a job. Yeah.
I have one more question as well online.
Yeah. Yeah, what's a general sense of what kind of relation to the Arab language to your subjects have? I think one of the interesting thing about medical professionals is that they all had to speak Arabic, I think. Whether you're a pharmacist, you deal with people that go into your pharmacy, you buy your stuff, whether you're a doctor, you're seeing patients. Again, I mean, I should say, and this is an important thing to say that I haven't said, that today in Israel, the medical sector is the most binational sector of the Israeli economy. It's where we can talk without idealizing, but where we have significant proportion of Palestinian citizens of Israel as doctors, certainly as pharmacists, we're talking about 50%, as doctors, among younger generations, 30%, a very significant share, and they are very much present. Now, if you're a doctor, if you're a Jewish Israeli doctor, your patients are going to speak. Some of your patients will be Palestinian citizens of Israel, and you need to study Arabic. There are courses for Arabic. So because of real necessity, so there, you know, the necessity of life makes people study Arabic. And I would say that in those cases we see clearly whether it's colloquial, but also in some cases spoken, written Arabic, Fusha is part of the story. So certainly, but I would say, okay, it's the level of Arabic knowledge is uneven within what I call local Ashkenazim, Middle Eastern Ashkenazim, and so forth. But it's generally much better than we assume. Because, and again, if we think about this for 2 minutes, it makes sense. If you grow up in Egypt, you would, you know, in Cairo and Alexandria, you would pick up Arabic to some extent. In the same way that if you grow up in Buenos Aires, you will pick up Spanish, you know, just for the necessity of life, even if that's not what you speak at home. And that is something that it's usually better than we expect.
That's everything. I'd like to thank our speaker very much for a fascinating evening. I'd like to thank you. I'd like to thank those online and in the room, Harris, family and friends. It's been a lovely evening. Thank you very much. See you again.